Hey guys, welcome back. So now getting back into Excalibur, which is where we discover not only the plan of Apocalypse with him having his desire to harness mutant magic, but along the way of us seeing him achieve that, we end up finding out there's quite a bit more that he's going for as well. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so just picking up right where we left off, to where upon their arrival in Otherworld, to where just before passing through, Shogo disappeared, and when Jubilee, Betsy, and Gambit appeared in Otherworld, like boom, Shogo was a dragon. And though we're not given the vivid explanation just yet, but with Psylocke we do have this case to where with her telepathy, she's able to communicate better with Shogo, and use that to better relay the messages which Shogo is trying to say. And it's something that really comes in handy, because along with this, Betsy's also able to see through Shogo's eyes as he flies around Otherworld, which is something that comes in handy pretty quickly, because early on she uses it to see through Shogo's eyes, and when doing so, when he flies over Camelot, she attempts to find her brother, but she doesn't necessarily see him because Shogo was just a baby flying through as a dragon, and so it's not like he's exactly find my iPhone or anything like that. But when this happened, Shogo did fly over Morgan Le Fay's tower in Camelot, to where at the time she's talking to Mariana, who's working for her in Earthrealm while Morgan Le Fay is in Otherworld. And with Morgan Le Fay, when she reaches out to Mariana, and Mariana gives her the report that she believes to know who's behind all of this as far as the weeds that have been growing throughout Camelot, to whom Mariana believes to be Apocalypse. And Morgan Le Fay is just like, okay, cool, just bring me his head. But what Morgan Le Fay is probably not really aware of is that that may be a problem with like the way his neck's set up, so it might be a little hard to get through all that and bring the whole head over there. And I mean, like, it ain't like I'm scared of nothing or I couldn't do it, it's just gonna be a lot of work. And not to mention, like in Mariana's case, like this is Apocalypse. His weaknesses are celestially bionic and his mutant powers have mutant powers. So like rather than bring you his head, why don't she just do something easy like just dance on the water and not get wet? Because for her that would be a more feasible request. But as far as getting back to where Shogo returned to the others, Betsy and Gambit had gotten into it as far as what their next move would be, with Gambit's main concern being Rogue and Betsy of course trying to get her brother back. And I gotta say, like in this case, Betsy is completely right, because even though Gambit is concerned about Rogue, they still need to keep in mind that Rogue is a mutant. And as far as priorities go, her brother Brian, and even Shogo for that matter, with them not being mutants, they don't have like the guarantee that the others have as far as being brought back from death. And of course a number of things are possible, and there are loopholes in certain situations, which we'll talk about more later. But even still with that, overall the general rule is like humans are at a much higher risk of a permanent dirt nap versus anyone who's a mutant. And with the way things are, like that's just a valid point. And it's for that reason, as it is now, rescuing Brian and keeping Shogo safe, like those have kept the top priority. Which is why when they get to Camelot, they kind of do the dragon base jump in order to keep Shogo at a distance. But even with doing so, they kind of realized that they left their big gun and just kind of flying around doing laps. And I imagine like when they got closer to the ground, it was like, oh, that's a lot of people. And so fairly quickly, Jubilee and Betsy is like, okay, we need to call the dragon. And right after that, they call Shogo right back down there. And when she did this, it was like in a very Green Ranger calling the Dragon Zord type of thing. But instead of the Dragon Zord showing up, it goes from ABC Family to HBO real quick. But with this happening, like they really needed Shogo to get back involved, mainly because Betsy was not able to control Morgan Le Fay's army, but instead she was just restricted to seeing like a small percentage of their surface thoughts, which is how she even knew that her brother was there as well, and not like taken or moved elsewhere. But even still, shortly after this, they're met with the arrival of Brian, still under Morgan Le Fay's influence. But also keep in mind, like even if this wasn't the case, she still wouldn't have been able to read his mind. And this is one of the things like with them being twins, to where between the two of them, there's always been this connection, but there's like this block at the same time. And this is something that's always been there, because if I'm not mistaken, like the way it works is like she can't read his mind, or she's never been able to use her telepathy on him. But I know for certain there's been cases to where one of them has been badly injured and the other can sense or feel it. And I really feel like we got a bit of both here, because with Betsy not being able to use her telepathy to track down Brian, but instead finding him by sensing him through the people around him. But even with that, because they can sense each other's pain, when they fought, there was like a moment where she was able to get through to him. But as soon as this happened and Shogo came to help out, Morgan Le Fay just pulled him away. And I really believe that's why she had got a glimpse of him coming back just in that brief moment. Because in addition to this, when they first arrived in Otherworld, or just not long before they made their way over here, Brian was able to sense his sister reaching out for him and trying to find him. And so that connection slash block thing that they got going is like the only answer I got for that. But when we get back over to Apocalypse, who's really come to the point to where he's figured that the some magic within these stones, which can only open a gate to Otherworld for a short period of time before their magic is completely depleted. It's then that he realizes that he needs to find something or someone that won't deplete, who is also a master of stones, so that they'll be able to sustain specifically what he needs them to do. But it's here where Apocalypse goes through this gate to find this mutant, and he just strolls through the park like making my way downtown. Really thick neck, gold on deck, I'm Apocalypse. But could you imagine Apocalypse doing like the and I miss you as he just strolls through the park? Like, what, you can't see it? Okay, alright, never mind. I digress. But as it turns out, we come to find out that he's here to get Rictor. And really, like, at the end of the day, who better? Avalanche? No. And it's not that I have anything against him, but he's not as powerful as Rictor. 2, he doesn't have as many powers as Rictor, which is really enough in itself because Apocalypse ain't really the type to run around looking for number 2. But really for Rictor, who at this point has lost control of his powers, and because of that he's locked himself in his apartment and like shut himself inside of this box in order to protect others from him. But when Apocalypse gets there and he rips the top off of this box, I can't really tell if Rictor is just afraid that somebody came in his house, or he's afraid that Apocalypse just rolled up on him unannounced. Could be a bit of both. But when he shows up here to get Rictor, Rictor tries to explain to him that he doesn't have control over his power, and he's been afraid to go to Krakoa because he doesn't want to step through that portal and just break Krakoa into pieces like a cookie. And Apocalypse just more or less tells him like, ain't no cookie you can break that I can't rebake. Let's go. And if you think about it, like if it did just get to the point where Rictor got out of hand, Apocalypse would probably just get big and pick him up, and then boom, problem solved. But with Rictor, when he goes with Apocalypse and they make their way to England, which is where Apocalypse had been working from since Betsy and the others had left, but it's shortly after that we find out that the British Secret Intelligence has been looking for Captain Britain. And this we find out by way of MI13, Pete Wisdom. And really he's somebody we haven't seen in a minute, but in his case he's caught up with everything. He knows that Betsy is Captain Britain now, but even with that, this guy goes way back, cause like with new Excalibur, he was part of the whole reformation of that team after House of M, with him being one of the few mutants who kept their powers after Scarlet Witch had said mutants no more. But not long after, when Gambit and the others came back from Otherworld, and when they get back, of course the first thing that Gambit does is check on Rogue. But even with doing so, he doesn't stay here long, because at this point there's really nothing that he could do. And for that reason he ends up agreeing to go with Betsy and Pete Wisdom for Betsy to meet up with the Queen herself, which is originally why Pete had came out there looking for her. And the main reason that Betsy had to come here is because with her being the active Captain Britain, it not only became her responsibility to handle these otherworldly matters, but with Captain Britain being a servant to the crown, she also has to report to the Queen and inform her of who she's working with, who's helping her out, to where in this case she officially tells her that the name of her team is Excalibur. But even when they go there, there's a number of people like protesting outside, and though there are some who just want to see the new Captain Britain, you also have others who just hate mutants. But even with that, Gambit ain't got no time for it. And in this case, it's like one thing for them to be yelling and holding up signs, but like when a dude throws a bottle, Gambit throws it back with a little charge on it, and he starts blowing up their signs, which is mainly in self-defense. But also with Gambit, he's kind of on a short fuse because of the whole situation with Rogue, and because of that it doesn't take much for him to go off, which really isn't a good look for people who just didn't see the whole thing. But essentially this meeting doesn't take too long, and Betsy comes back out and she explains all this to Gambit, Rictor, and the rest of the crew. And with this she lets them know that not just herself but all of them are accountable to the Queen. And so when they meet with Apocalypse to fill him in, and with this he very much understands that Captain Britain has her duties, but even with this Gambit expresses that his main concern is Rogue, and Apocalypse agrees. And with that, it's here that they essentially split up into two teams, with Betsy and Pete Wisdom handling the Queen's concerns with Coven Akaba, but as far as the second team, the others who Apocalypse would need in order to help out Rogue, as it turns out they have to take something from deep within the earth, so to do so they need a Master of Earth and a Master Thief, which makes it pretty clear really quick that he's talking about Rictor and Gambit. But when we find out what Apocalypse actually sent them to go get, it's something that plays out in a pretty cool way, because essentially with him sending Gambit and Rictor to go get more of the stones, which are actually made from the bones of like really old mutants, to where we find out these stones contain their energy, which is what Apocalypse has been using. But once again, when he uses them, they deplete quick, which is why we know Apocalypse went to go get Rictor. But in a way, it's also why he sent Rictor here with Gambit to get these stones, or these stone bones. But even with this, it didn't take them long to figure out why Gambit was also here, like why they needed a thief, with these stones belonging to the druids who live here in these caves and have been guarding these stones for years. But on top of that, when they see Rictor and they see that he can actually control the terrain, much like how they can, this is where it switches up. Because for the druids who first don't really trust anybody who's trespassing within their caves, let alone someone who's come there to steal these stones, of which they kind of give us this inkling that Gambit and Rictor aren't the first. And I mean, there's that and all these bones lying around here and there. But the thing is, like, when they make their way to what appears to be this vault where a bunch of these stones are kept, and it's then that the druids catch up with them and more or less keep them from getting crushed while in there. But it's here that they recognize Rictor's abilities, and when they ask him has he been able to do this since birth, and he's like, well, more or less, then they're just like, oh, you're one of us. And much like we had seen when they had cooperated with Betsy Braddock, with them having a mutual enemy in the Akaba, it's for that reason that they actually help Rictor here and give him the stones that he needs. Because really, the ones that they were taking when they got in the vault, they were empty. Like, their power had already been depleted, and had they taken those back to Apocalypse, they would have been no good. And actually, all the other stones that were there in the vault, they were just a distraction for thieves, of whom they really don't take a liking to. And because of the way that they see it, like, Rictor, he has a right to get one of the stones, but for Gambit, he's considered just to be a trespasser and a thief. And when they essentially try to kill Gambit for attempting to steal some of these stones, Rictor tries to use his power to help Gambit, but even still he doesn't have it all the way under control. But with Gambit falling to his death, and Rictor not being able to use his powers precisely enough to save him, he then uses some of the power from the stone, and even with doing so being careful not to use too much, but with doing this he was able to save Gambit, and likely because he was never told just yet about the whole mutant resurrection program, because even still he hasn't been to Krakoa just yet. But in the case of Pete and Betsy, who go to meet with Ruben and Mariana, and with doing so it was supposed to be like Pete was bringing Betsy here as a representative of the Queen as shield to the throne, and she was supposed to find a peaceful resolve with the Akaba, but as it turns out, that's not why the Akaba wanted her here. But instead, as it turns out, her being called to meet here was only a distraction, because when they were in Otherworld, to where the barriers of its reality, they're so fragile that they can be broken with Dragonfire, as it turned out, Shogo's Dragonfire actually made it weak enough for it to tear right through. And so now when this happens, it really flips things on its head, because when Betsy and Pete discover this, she lets him know that she immediately has to get back to the lighthouse. And it's not just to what it means for her and her family, but there's also this case of helping Apocalypse, who at one point needed power to open this door, but now it's like he needs that same power to close it. And for Pete, who's like, yeah, I'm totally listening, so let's go back to my flat, which Betsy admits sounds like a weird offer, especially at this moment in time with everything going crazy. But as it turned out, when they got in there, he showed her that it has the perfect view of the closest gate, so that this way she can get back to the others as quick as possible, because why else would he ask her to come up there? But she definitely takes this opportunity to get back to Apocalypse and the others, because like with Apocalypse, there's a few things going on here. Because one, he was definitely waiting on the stones which he had sent Rictor and Gambit to go steal for him so he can use them against Morgan Le Fay. But with this unexpected breach which was caused by Shogo, this then kicked things off a lot earlier than what Apocalypse had expected. And it's really at this point in time where a lot of these things get revealed, which even still I believe is like the tip of the iceberg. Because in addition to this, we then get our confirmation that Apocalypse this whole time, he's been keeping Rogue suppressed, mainly because he had a specific time that he needed her to awaken, and really this whole time he had just been stalling for like this specific alignment between the X gene, the sun and the moon, which is ultimately this concept of magic, which claims that sapiens with the X gene, better known as mutants, that they're designed to be the more powerful magic wielders, which is a pretty crazy concept. But Gambit and Rictor, like, they totally messed this whole thing up. And how did they mess it up? I'm glad you asked, because Gambit, for one, of course you know that he wants to get Rogue out of this Sleeping Beauty state. So to do so, what he ended up doing was asking someone to go inside of Rogue's mind and kind of help guide her out of there, who I believe at the time was Rachel Summers, who appeared to Rogue like in her mind as like this Phoenix wolf thing. But with doing this in Rogue's mind and literally having her going rogue, but there's a reason that Apocalypse wanted Rogue in this dreamlike place, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. But when Apocalypse found this out, he was pissed. When Gambit told him and spilled the whole plan, like, yeah, this is what I did, Apocalypse was like, I will bury you. And like, he hit Gambit so hard, like, I'm surprised Gambit didn't just wake up on the next page in a birthing pod and just wake up like, man, like, how did I die? And when he wakes up, Charles is just like, oh yeah, Apocalypse punched you, welcome back. But no, really, at this point with Gambit knocked out, and Apocalypse then tries to use the stones, which have insufficient funds on them, and because of that, he then gets mad at Rictor, who does admit that he used some of the power to save Gambit before, but at the same time, it's like you can't really blame Rictor because he hasn't been told or explained to about everything that's going on necessarily. And it's like when Apocalypse tells Rictor that these are ancient bones and the power that's in them, it's finite, and once that power is spent, it's just spent. And at that point, Rictor was like, man, well dang, I just thought they were stones. But even with that, we do know that Rictor consents that they were more than stones because he had picked that up originally when they'd entered the cave. But at this point in time for Apocalypse, it's like this circumstance is like almost the perfect opportunity, with the tear between the lighthouse and Otherworld happening before he expected. But if he had had the sufficient stones, he would then be able to do what he needed to do, which then had him looking at Gambit for another way to make this happen. But at this point, that's when Rogue came back, and all she had seen was Gambit not moving with Apocalypse over his body, and really for all she knew, he was dead. And when she comes back, she is beating the mess out of Apocalypse. And for Apocalypse, like, that's when the light bulb goes off, because for this ritual to be complete, he needed Rogue to cross over into that place in between where our world and Otherworld meet, and with Rogue absorbing the power from that gate, she was like the only one who could make that happen. And in this moment here, with them needing bones that are like 10,000 years old, or perhaps even older, Apocalypse then tells her to not let go, because with him dying here, that'll then be the last piece to make the ritual complete. But as far as the alignment with like the sun and moon and becoming like the ultimate magic wielder, like that's gonna have to wait for another day. But in the case of having Rogue actually here and Apocalypse sacrificing himself by allowing her to kill him, this completed the ritual to where they can cross into Otherworld when they want. And in the case of Rogue, who absorbed much of Apocalypse's power and a bit of his temper, which we'll see later on, like she ends up looking pretty badass. But in addition to this, she had also seen the thoughts of Apocalypse, and at least to the point of where now she knows that the reason that he'd want this door open, it was mainly because he has plans for taking the throne of Morgan Le Fay. But there's so much more to it than that, because man, but we'll get to it in the next one. But real quick, I want to give a shout out to all the patrons. Thank you for all of your support. And we got a few new patrons for the month of February. So shout out to Dre J, Brett H, Eobard T, and I think most of y'all know that guy. But also Jack S, Ahmad H, PJ, Dorothy, and Princeton J. So shout out to all of you and welcome to the Patreon squad. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.